Okay, we got that going. So welcome everybody. This is the first meeting in the revamped systems and complex adaptive thinking meetup group. As you know, several of you have been here in this group for a long time. It started initially as Systems Thinking Toronto, but with the pandemic, we dropped the Toronto because it's become a North American context now than local as we moved all our activities over to Zoom. And systems thinking is one type of thinking predicated over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it's time to move to modern practices building on top of what they did over the years. And we're pleased to bring Dave Snowden, one of the big proponents of complexity thinking, to our group in the refactored group to help kick us off to new forms of thinking. Dave, as many of you know, actually needs no introduction, is the inventor of the Cynefin framework. I've been following Dave's work since the last 3 or 4, 5 years, and good or bad, Dave has provided lenses that has corrupted my way of looking at the world, and I'm not able to look at it the same way anymore. So that's a big thing that he has brought to me personally. So I thought I should bring him as the first guest to kick off this change in this group. For those who don't know him, Dave is the Chief Scientific Officer of Cognitive Edge. That's one of the jobs that he does, is the modeling and detailing the framework and talking and propagating about the work that he does. Other than that, he's also a professor of a couple of universities where he helps develop the thinking and praxis behind complexity. So he wears multiple hats, and he's also an avid blogger and speaker. So without much ado, I'm going to turn him over to you. And he is presenting on managing complexity and chaos in the times of crisis today. And there is an associated field guide that has been recently launched, and post this meeting, we will send out the link so people are interested in downloading and reading it. Plus, of course, a video of this session will also be published in case you want to go back and review the constructs of the discussions that are being made today. With that, I turn you over to Dave.
Okay, so one of the things I've found with Zoom conversations is while you can hold a physical audience for 90 minutes, you can't hold a virtual audience. So my plan is to sort of do this in a series of stages. I'm going to give a high-level position, then stop for questions and discussion. And to be quite honest, if the discussion just carries on, that's fine. If not, I'll pick up on themes and represent. It's very useful to me if people could switch their videos on, because then at least I feel I'm talking to something, right? Whether it's got weird backgrounds or not, I'm getting used to. And just to warn you, a white cat may suddenly jump onto my shoulders, dig its claws in, and then look at you. All right, it's called a blow film moment now. Right? If you don't know that, you're not at the right age. Right? Okay. So let's establish some stuff on this for a start. The field I work in is called naturalizing sense making. Right? Now that's important. There are now recognized as, and I'll put this up so you've got it. There are now recognized as 5 distinct schools of sense making. One actually fits in quite closely with systems thinking. And to be honest, when I talk about systems thinking, I'm mostly talking about systems dynamics and cybernetics. Right? So that it all gets a bit mixed up, but that's what I'm talking about. So one of the schools of sense making comes from that background. It's basically links back to Shannon and Weaver, the information centricity that you see in cybernetics and so on, and that's a distinct school. You then have Gary Klein, who's I've worked with a lot, who's coming at it from the point of view of cognitive psychology. If you don't know, Gary was the first person to identify by experimental observation that people make decisions based on patterns rather than rationally. And he did that in a lot of pioneering work with firefighters and other people. It's called a first fit pattern match. and I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Then there's Brenda Dervin, who's at Ohio, who is coming in from library science and communication theory and postmodernism. And then, of course, there's the great granddaddy of sense making, Carl Weick, who really comes from a sort of American normative sociological tradition. And then there's my school, which is called naturalizing. Now, I'll make the distinctions to make it clear, because this is also where I think complexity is taking us. If you look at Weick's work, Weick goes and studies what people do. And this is the classic sort of social science approach. And from that derives theory. So it's a sort of observational process. And from that, you say, this sort of thing is going on. This is what I think it means. And Weick's work, I think, is brilliant. The original book on sense making is a classic. The problem with, and this is what we also call in logic, it's an inductive approach. The assumption is you can observe human phenomena, and from that you can derive general rules and principles. So in logic term, that's inductive. You're making an approach on that. Now this, to my mind, has a significant problem with context. So if you look at Weick and Sutcliffe's work on high reliability organizations, which is also considered a classic, and he does what anybody in knowledge management will tell you should do anyway, is if you can get people to share failure, knowledge distributes. In fact, failure is more important than success. Again, to give you some of the science on this, the human brain pays immediate attention to failure, but it may ignore success. And one of the reasons for that is avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. Which is why, you know, if you actually go to water cooler stories in organizations, they're generally negative stories, not positive stories. And the theoretical argument in this says we evolved as malicious gossips because it actually has evolutionary advantage. So Weick studies a group of organizations that naturally share failure. Now, I remember when I read the book, I looked at it and said, but you haven't pointed out the context of this, is you've studied what we call crews. So he looks at aircraft, you know, aircraft carriers and firefighters. Now, if you look at a crew, and this is a military function, you're not dealing with a team of individuals, you're dealing with a highly ritualized collection of roles. So in a crew, people are trained in role and role expectation, like in an operating theatre, for example. If a surgeon puts up a hand, a trained nurse will know exactly what instrument he needs put in it, even if they've never worked together before. Now, this is a common military function. And one of the things about crews is that they actually generally share failure because it's the role saying what the role did, not the individual in that sense. There's a big difference. And I remember saying at one conference, and I probably shouldn't have done this, this is my irreverency, I'm afraid, and some people appreciate it and some people don't. And I remember saying, you know, Carl's results are fine, but I can't burn the office down every morning to get the behavior of firefighters. You can't generalize from one context into another context. But I'm afraid that's a sort of rhetorical device which doesn't go down well with very senior professors in American universities, but I'm probably not going to stop anytime soon. So the context issue is a significant one there. And the approach I started to adopt years ago, because my background, if you don't know it, is physics and philosophy as a joint major. All right, and from a physicist's point of view, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion in the first place. Yeah, and I'm not going to back off on that one. And we won't talk about what philosophers think about social scientists until I've had at least a couple of gin and tonics. So the problem you've got is you haven't got context, you haven't got enough data, and you're also dealing with a constantly shifting environment. Yeah? The other point is, and this comes into the whole best practice, or nearly 99% of management books, is you get a massive confusion of correlation with causation. So if you look at, say, Good to Great, which is actually quite a well-researched book, somebody goes and studies companies which have been successful for a long period of time. All of them have failed in the last few years, by the way, but let's just ignore that for the moment, all right? That's inconvenient, yeah? So he just studies that, he identifies things that they do in common, and then there's his conclusion, if you do these things, you too will be successful, right? Now, that's the basis of virtually every book you can read in management science. These are the cases, these companies or these leaders exhibit what we consider ideal qualities. If you do this, you will get the same result. Now, in real science, as I say, that's called the confusion of correlation with causation. The vast majority of CEOs of American Fortune 500 companies play golf, but it doesn't mean that you should substitute golf classes for management education. Yeah, it's a coincidence. And the other one I love, if you don't know it, if any country wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it has, all it has to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. I mean, this is good news, because dark chocolate consumption per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 3 decades. And that's a much bigger data set than any social scientist has ever had before they form any conclusion whatsoever. So the correlation causation confusion is a massive issue. The lack of understanding context. So for example, look at Good to Great. Good to Great looks at the companies who were the first into their ecological niche. Now, if you know anything about apex predators, you'll know that once the apex predator is established, the ecosystem evolves around them, like our technology evolved around IBM, and they survive no matter how incompetent they are until the ecosystem is radically disrupted. Right? So there is actually a better explanation of the phenomena than this sort of causal inductive link. Yeah, and there's a body of theory around that. So what I and colleagues started to do initially in IBM, then outside of IBM, left IBM about 17 years ago. Yeah, actually around about this time of the year, 17 years ago. And what we started to do is say, well, why don't we use natural science as a core set of body of theory around which we will build practice in organizations. So we'll take natural science as a constraint, and within those constraints, we'll build methods. The name for this is praxis, which anybody from the 70s will recognize as a key term. This is me going back to my Catholic Marxist and liberation theology days, where we used to say praxis makes perfect, right? So practice is the interaction of theory with practice. All right, so there are things we know about humans. So let's just run through some of those to make the point. What I've already made is we learn more from failure than we learn from success. Yeah, and we can see an evolutionary reason for that. You know, failure repeats frequently, success very rarely does, or it's deeply contextual. The other thing is that you actually only see what you expect to see. And you can't be trained not to do that. So if you give a batch of X-rays to some radiologists, for some reason, radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community, by the way. So they keep conducting experiments on them. I don't know what they did, but they did something really evil in their past. So they're now the victims. Right? So you give radiologists a batch of X-rays, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes scan it. And that's called inattentional blindness. Now, that one simple scientific fact invalidates virtually all social science research. You only see what you expect to see. Yeah, and a whole body of other things like systems analysis or inquiry. And the way this works, by the way, is that the most you observe of what's available data is probably about 3 or 4%. It maxes out at about 5%, unless you're Chinese, where it roughly doubles. It's actually quite interesting. If you put 3 objects on a table, Chinese students will talk about the relationship between the objects. American students will talk about the relative size of the objects. If you show a picture of a tiger drinking from a stream in a forest, American students will see the tiger and miss the forest. Chinese students will see the forest and miss the tiger. Yeah, and we think it's a context object difference, and it's actually the difference in the co-evolution of language in the brain. That if you speak in Mandarin, you have to understand the context of each symbol. Yeah, you can't, yeah, and so there's some interesting facts on that. But the fact is, most human beings, you don't see much. And having scanned maybe 3 or 4% of what's in front of you, 5% if you're really focused, yeah, that triggers a series of memories of things that you did, things that you've learned, things that you've been trained on, things you heard from people you know. And then you blend those together. It's called conceptual blending in the literature. And the first blend, which fits what you've observed, you apply. So you do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Okay? So you look at some data, and the minute you get something which seems to work, that's what you act on. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this applies. You know, if you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and have an identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? You know, by that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, written by a survivor. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly. Yeah, privilege in our most recent experience. Okay? Now, once you know that that's a fact, you start to build methods and tools which work with that rather than trying to pretend you can train people not to do it. And by the way, you can train people not to do it if you make them fully autistic, but then they can't operate. Yeah, because they're actually literally seeing everything and assessing it objectively, so they get a massive data information overload. Yeah. Now, I'm using that one because it's one of the best examples. And when I come onto the field guide in a minute, one of the big things we focus on in that is you need to create a huge network of a multicultural, multi-experiential network, which can give you real-time feedback loop, real-time feedback data, because you need to find the 17%. Yeah, particularly in a crisis, you need to find the people who are seeing the problem differently from other people. And you can't train yourself to do that. So you have to build systems or decision support systems which will actually help you do that. All right? So you start to see how naturalizing sense making work. And I define sense making, by the way, which I use with a hyphen, because I don't like neologisms. Sense making is, how do I make sense of the world so that I can act in it? And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. Is, how do I know enough to know that I can take an action in the moment? And I hasten to confess this, but somebody said the other day I needed to watch Frozen 2, which normally I wouldn't do, but I decided, oh, to hell with it, I'm tired, I might as well do it. And I decided I quite like Frozen 2, all right? I've got into it. It's a sentimental side of me. Frozen 1 was terrible, right? But Frozen 2 I'm quite fond of now, right? And one of the key phrases in Frozen 2 is do the next right thing. Yeah, that's actually quite a good point about understanding how you manage uncertainty. You can't know what you should do, but if you do the next right thing, that sort of makes sense, right? So you didn't expect Frozen. I'm going to introduce Derrida in a minute. So if I can do Frozen and Derrida in one presentation, I'll feel good about life, right? So that brings me on to complexity. Now, again, I want to make two key distinctions here, and I want to make something clear. One of the things you get trained on as a philosopher is to make distinctions, because if you make distinctions, you get new meaning. The trouble is, there seems to be a whole bunch of people who think if you make a distinction, you're privileging one thing over another. A distinction just says these things are different. Right? But some people can't stand that. So I'm currently suffering a sort of, I'm not sure what the collective name is for cyberneticians. I'm looking at coterie at the moment. So I'm suffering from a coterie of cyberneticians who keep jumping on me in social media and attacking me. Because I'm basically saying complexity science is not systems thinking. And the reason I'm saying that, which is not to say systems thinking doesn't have value, but complexity science deals with systems without material linear causality. Right? Now that's actually really important, because if you work with non-causal systems, that's different from highly complicated systems with multiple feedback loops. And in response to the thing, but we've always dealt with those anyway, well, the answer is yes. People used to build locks on canals to deal with gravity. But then Newton discovered the theory, the science of gravity, and everything changed. Yeah, so the fact the body of theory may have adjusted a series of problems doesn't mean it's the same as when you actually have a scientific explanation of this. And remember, complexity science comes from chemistry and biology with some origins in systems, but its principal sources is actually the natural sciences. So I'm making a distinction, not to say that, I have huge respect for people like Beer and Ackoff and other people like that, and there's a whole body of stuff I use from that, but I'm trying to make a difference that makes a difference, and there's a deliberate play there with Bateson and Ackoff anyway, right? Complexity science deals with systems which have no causality, or at least no material linear causality, in which phenomena emerge as a result of changes on constraints. I'll come on to constraint mapping in a minute when I go into the EU field guide. So there's kind of like one distinction there, which says complexity is kind of like a unique body of knowledge here. Yeah, like all bodies of knowledge, they have multiple entangled threads. But that simple natural science base and the recognition of constraints, strange attractors, all these sort of things, means we're into a different field, which ironically is much simpler. And that generally happens. Natural science makes things simple. Once you actually find some fundamental rules in life is a lot easier. The other distinction I make is between what I term anthro-complexity and computational complexity. So computational complexity is what you see in places like Santa Fe and other areas. This is the classic bird flocking behavior, termite nesting. So birds fly around in the sky based on three simple heuristics. Fly to the center of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but Boyd's algorithm is a good summary. And by the way, Italian drivers south of Naples drive the same way. I give you this as a free lesson, right? If you want to drive the Alfini coast, which I can now do without stress, because I've learned that you follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision, and you ignore traffic lights and traffic laws because they're not there to be followed. Yeah? I still remember the first time I drove through Naples in a hire car, the traffic light changed orange to go red, so I slowed down. And there was a massive crash behind me. I was okay, but there was all the cars behind me hit each other, because the rule in Naples is when the light goes orange, you go faster to get as many people as possible through before the light goes red. And I wasn't aware of that sort of informal rule, right? Now that sort of stuff is powerful, right? So I can simulate, and what's interesting is the correlation causation confusion of one group of people is often, people then often confuse simulation with prediction. All right, the fact I can build a model which simulates birds flying around in the sky doesn't mean I can predict whether they'll go to the left or right of a mountain the next time they hit it. Yeah, and that difference is significant. Right? And the other problem you've got is that human beings are not ants or termites. I keep having to say this. Human beings have intelligence, they have multiple identities. We're the only species which shows altruism outside a kinship group. So from my point of view, the study of complexity in human systems is a distinct field. It draws on computational complexity, but it also draws on cognitive neuroscience, it draws on anthropology, it draws on a whole body of theory, because human beings have a different type of agency in their interactions to what you actually see happening within ants' nests or termites' nests. Yeah, and they famously had to do a keynote at a conference in Italy. So this was the European Complexity Conference. And they said, would I come along and give my presentation on why models don't work for humans? Because they don't. Right? So I said, fine, no problem. Nobody told me the entire audience was composed of academics who built models for a living. They didn't warn me about that, so it was like Daniel in the lion's den. Fortunately, the other keynote was Murray Gell-Mann, and he backed me up, and I'm still quite proud of that, all right? And he famously said, not just then at other times, the only valid model of a human system is the system itself. Right? Now, that's actually a really important statement, and the work we do in what's called distributed ethnography or rich data is to get the system to model itself in real time. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute. So those two distinctions for me are important, which is not to say I don't value and use computational complexity, and not to say that I don't value and use stuff from cybernetics and systems dynamics, but you need to make distinctions in order to understand where different things apply. And that's a really important principle, yeah, in terms of the way things work. So the other thing about complex adaptive systems, and this is where we get onto the concept of emergence, which is one of the most misused words in human history. I've just been dealing with somebody who basically is in a sort of quasi-religious mode, who says there's no point in applying science because everything is about transformational experience, which of course he can help you on. And I've also discovered a problem because I started to get ironic in response. That didn't work. So I got really sarcastic and said, well, I've been trepanned, which I have, right? It's an 8,000-year-old operation. So I said, I am going to go round to Avebury Stone Circle and use my mystical third eye in order to actually get status within the New Age community. And he thought I was being serious. So if people can't get sarcasm, you've got a major problem, right? Emergence is often used as an excuse. You'll find people say it's emergent, therefore we can't do anything about it. Or complexity is uncertain, so just do whatever you want. That's actually not the case. One of the key things about a complex adaptive system, particularly in humans, is that it has constraints. There are aspects of a complex adaptive system which you can manage. And just to make a key distinction here, if you look at the origins of the word manage, in Italian it's manège, in French it's manage. And the Italian comes from the ability to ride a horse in dressage. The French derivation means household management. Right? And part of the argument here is that ordered systems you manage like a household budget because you've got predictability. Complex systems you still manage, but you manage like you ride a horse. And within a complex system, the things that you manage are constraints. Right? So we're currently working on a constraint typography at the moment. And we're about to produce, we're doing some work on semiotics and symbols to actually produce constraint maps. That's going on within the wiki. If I give you, I mean, we worked for about 3 years on this with academics at Stanford and elsewhere. This is part of a complexity-based approach to design thinking, which I can give you more details on if you want. But one of the things you do is you've been creating a typology of constraints. Now remember, a typology is not a taxonomy, so I'm talking about a typology. You can have the difference, for example, between an exto and an endoskeleton. So if you look at an exoskeleton, which is what an insect has, that's an external carapace, which means you've got a predictable boundary layer, yet with no variation in that. And you've also got a limitation on size. I mean, all those horror movies about giant ants are not possible. I think the maximum size an insect can get to is about 4 foot before it collapses under gravity. On the other hand, we have an endoskeleton. So there's a coherent structure to humans, but there's a massive variety around that skeleton. But we're still constrained by the basic underlying tissue. Does that get the principle? There are resilient constraints and robust constraints. Example I normally use of that is a seawall or a dike is a robust constraint. Yeah, it's physical, it's intact, it's actually highly efficient because you can drain the landward side and plant crops. But if it exceeds its design condition, it breaks catastrophically and it doesn't recover. With no apologies whatsoever to the great and glorious Taleb, it doesn't get stronger by breaking, it gets weaker. Yeah, and it doesn't recover. On the other hand, if you look at a salt marsh is resilient, it's not robust because it constantly fluidly changes to accommodate different circumstances. So a resilient system or a resilient constraint has continuity of identity over time. Yeah, so you can see the evolutionary process. And if the salt marsh gets saturated, it doesn't release the water catastrophically like the dam, it just gradually fills up and overflows. Right? So we can have resilient constraints, we can have robust constraints. The other distinction which is used a lot, and Alicia uses this, is the difference between enabling constraints and governing constraints. So governing constraints give you predictability, enabling constraints, well, the example I normally use is the difference between rules and heuristics. So if you look at the American Marines, and I do a fair amount of work in Quantico, if the battlefield breaks down, the battlefield plan is an ordered approach. then the Marines are trained to capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Right? Those are called heuristics, and heuristics are enabling constraints. It's like Napoleon famously transformed warfare by saying, if in doubt, march to the sound of the guns. Now, that actually handles uncertainty because it gives you predictive capacity under conditions of uncertainty, because you know the other generals will be marching to the sound of the guns. So you start to create self-organizing capacity within the system. And the key thing on managing complexity is not to decide where you want to go. And this is one of the really big differences. Right? You don't say we want to be X type of an organization or we want to achieve Y type of result. Yeah. In complexity, you don't seek to attain goals. You start journeys with a sense of direction. Right? I'll repeat that because it's critical. You don't try and achieve goals because if you don't have a linear relationship between cause and effect, you can't define a goal anyway. Yeah, what you do is you have to understand the present. You can't say, this is where we want to be, how do we close the gap? Which is the dominant form of popular forms of systems thinking at the qualification for the last 3 decades. Yeah, what you actually do is say, where am I? What possible changes can I make? And are they going in roughly the right direction? I'll come back to Frozen, all right? Do the next right thing. All right, now in complexity, this is going back to Kaufman, this is called an adjacent possible. And we use fitness landscapes from evolutionary biology a lot to actually map the current situation. And what a fitness landscape reveals is what the energy cost is of change. Right? Now here I'm throwing some more science in. We bring now in constructor theory from physics, which basically says within the laws of natural science, whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. So if you're managing a complex system, you have to manage the energy gradient so the things you want are more likely than the things you don't want. And I can expand on that later if you want, but that's actually a key change. You manage the ecosystem so the things you want are more likely than the things you don't. And anybody who's got teenage children knows this anyway. Yeah, I mean, I hope nobody has KPIs and mission statements for their family and their teenagers. Yeah. I should be careful about this because I was giving a presentation in Dallas and I was still recovering from the fact I was working with the Ebola management teams. And I was told I couldn't use evolutionary theory because it was a controversial idea. And that was with the Ebola management team. So, you know, this is kind of like slightly worrying. So I was in a disturbed state, right? And then I satirized the idea of mission statements, KPIs and goals and said nobody would do that for their families, and discovered there is a whole industry in Texas which does exactly that. Yeah, the family therapists will come in and agree targets and goals. And at that point, I got even more depressed, yeah, and left. Right? But you don't do that, right? If you're managing teenagers, you make it easier for them to do good things and harder for them to do bad things. Yeah, it's not that we don't know this stuff. We do it all the time anyway. Right? And that means the most critical thing that you're ever doing is to map where you are and where you can go next. Now, to give an illustration of this, we've been doing a lot of work on citizen engagement, and we may be about to start a project in the States, which if we started, I'll talk a lot about it, which is to do post-election peace and reconciliation. Yeah? And that is going to use young people as journalists to their communities through schools and religious groups and sports clubs. Now, we did this in South Wales, we've done it in Sweden, we've done it in actually Pakistan, we've done it in Libya. And it's where you use children to act as ethnographers to their own communities. Now, this is actually quite an important principle because it's a non-intrusive approach. To use some language from feminism, it doesn't damage cognitive sovereignty. If you're being interviewed by your own children or your own grandchildren or friends of those children, yeah, the interviewing is being done within the community itself. It's not somebody from an external culture. And the big thing we focused on in our work here is actually to create epistemic justice because power comes from interpretation. It's not the story which counts, it's who interprets the story. Right? So the work we did in this originally came from the Genoa 2 project in DARPA when I was working for Poindexter et al. What we do is basically children act as ethnographers to their community. They gather stories. The adults self-interpret their own stories into a quantitative framework. This is a system model in itself. And from that, we can create maps which look like contour maps, where tight contours mean strong attitudes, weak contours mean weak attitudes, and so on. And we can actually identify outliers. So we can, if anybody here is a walker, if you walk down the valleys or walk along a ridge, it's easier than walking in a straight line. So we can create those maps. So we can actually say these pathways will be easier than those pathways, but you might do this, but the energy cost is high, it will be very difficult. And critically, we can identify two other things. We can identify this concept of the adjacent possible, where there's a pattern in a better place than where we are now. And then literally you click on the pattern of the better place and you see the stories which created it. And you say, what can I do tomorrow to create more stories like these? And you click on the negative pattern and read the stories and say fewer stories like those. Now this is called vector theory of change. And again, it comes from anthropocomplexity. More stories like this, fewer stories like that can engage anybody. If you say to nurses, and we've done this, how do you create a safer environment for patients? Then they'll say that they're already doing that. They'll get defensive. If you actually have patients continuously tell their stories, which we've been doing in Ireland now for a decade, and you say to nurses, how do we create more patient stories like these and fewer patient stories like that? You get engagement. And the reason is you're switching from evaluation to description. Right? So there are two key fundamental principles in operation here. Evaluation causes stress in humans. The minute you ask human beings to evaluate something, they start to play games. They worry about how it will be used. They start to change the way they do things. It's why opinion polls are actually really bad in tight elections, because people don't answer, they answer how they think they should answer, not how they actually feel. Yeah, that's well established. Right? So kind of like the principle is, that first and fundamental principle there is you need to switch from evaluation to description. So if you say to people, for example, let's give you another question. Instead of asking people in the employee satisfaction survey, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, 0, not at all, 10 all the time, which is a hypothesis-based evaluation question, we take an entirely different approach. We say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company? Yeah, that's a non-hypothesis question. And it's deeply contextual. And then we ask people to interpret that story. And one of the ways we interpret, for example, is to give them a triangle. And it says, in this story, the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. So we put 3 positive qualities. There is a science behind this, by the way. One of the advantages of having a visiting chair in psychology is you can wire up first-year students and conduct experiments on them. All right? What that actually does is
do you want to pause for a second to take some questions?
Yeah, just 2 seconds. I'm coming to a pause naturally, right? So just give me a second. Right?
Yep.
So what we do with the triangle is it creates a cognitive load, which means people don't know what answer they should do. So to use Kahneman's terms, they switch from thinking fast to thinking slow. So you get deeper. So with 6 triangles, I get a huge amount of quantitative data, and I can look at the patterns revealed by that and say to a manager, more stories like this, fewer stories like that. Okay. The second thing is that, and this is kind of like the point on which I was planning to conclude anyway, is you move from this is the problem, this is the solution, to how do we create a capability, which means that solutions will emerge from the system itself. Okay? Now, I can talk a lot through more on that and some of the trials we're doing in Florida at the moment. But the basic switch on complexity is the volume of change which is going on is such that you can't wait to find a problem, then create a solution. You have to create capability in the system which can solve problems for itself. We're sometimes terming this as rewilding, and if rewilding is not returning to the wild, it's restoring balance in the system. And one of the most single effective ways of doing that is to densely entangle the informal networks. And I can talk about that later. Okay. So a final point to make, the EU field guide, which you've actually got, and if you haven't, that's the actual link. That's a joint publication of my Cynefin Centre with the European Union. Rather ironic, given that the English took us out of Europe. We're blaming the English for Brexit entirely, by the way, but in Wales, we generally blame the English on first principles. It's where we start, right? Canadians have the same issue with America, and New Zealanders have the same issue with Australia. You know, it's small nations large next to a large arrogant neighbor who thinks they're part of them, right? So that's where it comes from. But say this is a joint publication. We've put it together over the last 5 months. The European Commission had already adopted Cynefin as a basic framing for complexity. And it's designed to be very simple for people to implement. Nothing in it says you need to behave like this, or your leaders need to have these qualities. It says you go through 4 stages: assess, adapt, accept, transcend. In each of those stages, you do these things. And that's actually where complexity comes from. We talk about how things connect. We don't talk about how things should be. Right? And that has major implications. A complex system is defined by its connections, not by its things. Okay, open to questions.
So I have a question from Craig Cockburn a little while back, talking about constraints. Do enabling constraints take you out of the complexity, and governing constraints stop you going into complexity? Craig, if you want to add something to that.
Governing constraints can make you believe you're not in complexity when you are. Let me give you an example, all right? I mean, if you want examples of governing constraints, work for IBM for 7 years, you'll find loads. All right, so sorry, this is a story, but it will illustrate the point. So we were a software house. We were bought by IBM. The first thing they did when they took us over was ban alcohol and charge us for coffee, which was kind of like, what the hell is going on here? I mean, the coffee alcohol cycle is critical to good software development anyway. But we sort of learned to live with that. And then the bastard said, you can't buy food for staff. Yeah, classic big company stuff. And by that time, we'd actually learned that you didn't argue with IBM HR logically. That never worked. The only thing which occasionally worked was to use a Socratic technique. And if you don't know Socratic technique, you ask people questions till they contradict themselves. Yeah, it's a huge amount of fun, but you have to remember that the people of Athens got so fed up with it, they voted for Socrates to commit suicide. Right? So either way, I'm by now a C-level executive, all right? And I'm told I can't buy, and I went to IBM HR and said, look, I got called out last night. Yeah, I was the bloody senior executive on duty. We've got an emergency telephone system on a VAX cluster, which has gone down because the operating system upgrade has failed. Largely because you idiots banned trainings and said people could do things from manuals, but I didn't go into that, right? And I said, my job as a senior executive, I don't know how to fix it. I just need the systems programmers to fix it. So I've got to keep people away from them and protect them so they can do the job, and keep them awake by buying pizza and Coke. And you've just said, I can't do it anymore. And they looked slightly worried. So I realized they might be misinterpreted in that. And I said, I do mean Coca-Cola. And there was some sighs of relief around the room, but it did give us some ideas for future events. And after muttering and hoarding, they said, okay, we accept you may have to do this. Vice presidential approval 48 hours in advance. And you can hear a HR bureaucrat in this. So you breathe very slowly, you know, Socratic technique, you ask questions, say, that's brilliant. You know, we would never have thought of that. This is one of the major advantages of joining IBM. And irony and sarcasm have again been used as a strategic weapon. We used to switch it on and off with HTML code in chats with HR. I said, what happens on the extremely rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major crisis? And they looked quite upset about that because kind of like they felt it was improper not to have notice of a crisis. You know, a well-run company wouldn't do that. And then they said yes in a way which meant no. So they said country general manager approval after the event. Now, if you work for IBM, you know that means your expenses will disappear in head office. They'll never be signed. If you complain, your name will appear on the wrong sorts of lists. So the practice emerged, and I hasten to say that I never did this, of course, all right? But I gather other people did, of over-tipping London taxi drivers, which means you get a blank receipt. The blank receipt was completed for the amount of money spent on pizza and Coke, and a claim for travel was submitted rather than pizza and Coke. Yeah, human beings are kind of like, I can't put up with this crap, I'm going to find a way around it. Now, I gave that as an example at the Scrum Alliance conference in Berlin a few years ago. And basically, 3 people from IBM ran up and showed me wallets full of blank receipts and said, we're still doing that. Did you invent it? Now, part of the problem you've got is if you are in a complex domain and you use governing constraints, the system will ultimately break catastrophically because actually you're over constraining the system. So if the system is complex, you focus on enabling constraints, not governing constraints. I'll give another example of that work we did with the New Zealand Tax Office, where we did a narrative-based inquiry and we discovered that garage owners had a natural constraint. They let apprentices do 1 cash job a week. Right? Now, of course, that wasn't declared for tax purposes. What we worked out is that was a self-regulating constraint. If we actually eliminated that, people would have got more devious about hiding the stuff. So we made it okay for apprentices to do 1 cash job a week. And we got the Garage Association people to enforce it. And that actually saved a fortune. You see how you start to work this sort of stuff? Yeah, you can't decide what type of system you're in. You can attempt to shift the system, but you can't decide what the system is. And that the higher level of entanglement and the more connections there are, the more it is inevitably a complex adaptive system, not an ordered system.
Dave, there's a related question from Andrea Swanson on how do you know what a good enough direction is when you steer a...
I could ask that question about your family as well. I mean, kind of like you do know that, right? And part of it is negotiation. One of the key things you do in a complex adaptive system is you do parallel safe to fail experiments rather than take a single track. Yeah, and you see what happens. So some of it is actually stimulating the system to see what's possible so that you can retrospectively decide whether it was right or not. Yeah, but still recover. So I think that's key. And I wrote a blog post about this recently. I mean, a good example of actually having a sense of direction is Kennedy's famous, we have to get a man on the moon. And of course it was going to be a man by X day. Now he could say that because the science had been worked out. It was just an engineering problem. Yeah, so the pathway was possible. Yeah, we could do the same now, by the way. I mean, we know the science of refreezing the poles, and why we're not focused on it, I don't know. Because if it's just an engineering issue, if we refroze the poles, we get another 20 or 30 years to sort out global warming. But people are looking at big solutions rather than, this is a key thing we say in the EU handbook, you make decisions fast to give yourself options downstream. You don't try and solve the big problem or say we can't do anything till everything's right. You do things right here and now fast, which give you options further, right? So you can set goals like that. Yeah, or you can set goals like, and human judgment is actually quite good on this, all right, which is, and this is what we do with a vector target. So a vector measures direction and speed of travel for intensity of effort. Yeah, so if I look at KPIs, I mean, this is me taking my own dog food, right? If in complexity, you start with where people are, people want things that they can set targets for. Now, we know that outcome-based targets are perverse, right? If I can give you the evidence on this, whenever people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Yeah, all the scientific evidence says that. And where do we have the highest level of explicit goals? Social services, education. Where do we actually most need intrinsic motivation in those areas? Look at the way that 3-star journal owners in academics actually control their fields and prevent new ideas coming in. Yeah, because a measurement system is, a target has become a measure, and if a target becomes a measure, it ceases to be a measure. On the other hand, the vector targets, and that's where we use fitness landscape, says we'd like to go here because we find these stories more desirable than those stories. And you can get consensus on that. And then you literally, a vector is, because you're doing this as continuous capture, is the pattern shifting in that direction? At what cost, at what speed? And that's a different type of KPI. And again, that's another way you create a sense of direction. Yeah? Is can we shift, and that's the next right thing, it's the frozen point. Let's agree what the next stepping stone is, then we'll reappraise, we'll move to another stepping stone, we'll reappraise, we'll move to another stepping stone. Leaves you more open to novelty than having too many long-term goals.
Thank you, Dave. There's one more question from Atanas, talking about, is there a way to inspect failure at its best without skipping a point where we can improve in order to avoid doing the same mistake twice without noticing it?
We do a lot of work in this. I mean, one of the things we do is build worst practice databases. Worst practice databases have far more participation than good practice databases. We've done a lot of work in aircraft manufacturing. I can tell you the story which gets told is not, I clipped my safety harness on so I didn't die. The story everybody tells is of their friend who didn't clip his safety harness on, fell off the aircraft, and happened to land on his friend who broke his leg, but he survived. Everybody loves that story and everybody tells it. And don't talk about the jumbo jet, which was barrel rolled under the San Francisco Bridge. They had to fire the pilot, but they sent him off to the space program instead. Now, those are the stories that everybody tells. What stories do you tell? We don't like stories in which everything is good. And even in evolutionary terms, we've learned to be deeply suspicious of those sort of stories. On the other hand, if I present 4 or 5 stories of failure, people will seek to avoid it. The other thing we do a lot of work on is to use counterfactuals and fiction. So if you look at project lessons learned, you create counterfactuals in which a successful project failed, get people to walk through the turning points and tell the stories of how it failed. Gary Klein's Premortem does the same thing. Because actually, if you increase the pressure on people in a fictional environment, you will get to the truth. There's a paradox in this. Ask people to tell the truth, they will lie. Tell people they can lie and they'll fall back to the truth. We have a major thing, this is part of the U Field Guide, in which we create a simulation game. And we either use science fiction or alternative history. So the first time I did this was with John Poindexter. And we had about 30 historians in Richmond, and we created an alternative history of the United States in which the South wins the Civil War. The key turning point was the very hypocritical declaration by Lincoln, which made slavery an issue, which happens 2 years in. And it's principally done to keep the British and the French from intervening, because the anti-slavery movement in Britain and France is so strong that there's no way they can interfere. So we went, if you haven't read Amanda Foreman's book, which is the history of the Civil War from British and French embassy records, go and read it, it's brilliant. So, the Southern strategy was to get the British, they knew they couldn't win against the North, so they wanted the British and the French to step in. And the British and the French wanted to step in because they didn't want a rival for empire, so you can see the motivations. I mean, it was much more complex than this, but we took that as a turning point. We then created, we had a ball for 3 days on this, all right? Texas becomes the American Saudi Arabia. A bunch of primitive farmers who got rich too quick for their own good due to the discovery of oil. And somebody said, well, that happened anyway. So we left that on one side. New England always wants to be European, but never quite make it. So they're a bit pathetic, really. Canada is the dominant economic power because you don't get the mass extermination of the Native Americans, which happened after the Civil War. And of course, the Canadian Native American Alliance, which won the War of 1812. And by the way, we did win that, guys. I know you guys say it was a draw, but we won that one. Basically, that doesn't happen. California falls to the Mexicans and falls to the Japanese in the Pacific Rim strategy in the Second World War. We had a ball. right? Now that alternative history was used last year. It gets used about once or twice. And what we do is we take a current foreign policy situation and we construct an aspect of the alternative history, and we land junior policymakers in it in a war game and see what they do. Right? The other variation we do on that in companies is we send in anthropologists, we study a company for a bit, and then we work with scientists who work for science fiction writers. And they construct an alien culture, which is actually the culture of the company itself. And then we land managers on an alien planet to survive in
Looks like there's technical problem and we lost Dave. I think he'll reconnect. Just let's give him a moment. He should be back. His internet was spotty today. Usually it's better than that.
hello.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. We had a brief power cut. Yeah. Okay, so just to finish off where I was on that, yeah, what we're then doing is we're allowing people to explore in a fictional universe, which means failure is easy to admit. And this is actually one of the main reasons for fiction in human evolution. If you look at the stories of the Mullah Nasruddin in the Sufi tradition, you know, if you do something stupid, you create a story about how the mullah does it, and everybody shares it. Yeah. So realize that, and just throw another bit of science in. Okay. If you don't know it, art comes before language in human evolution. All right, and one of the functions of art is to allow us to make novel connections. So it probably starts accidentally, but what happens with, if you go up a level of abstraction, you can create completely novel connections between things. If you stay in the concrete, you can't. Right? So fictional storylines and counterfactuals create far more powerful learning because people explore things which could have gone wrong as well as things which actually went wrong. And you build better data spaces from that. Yeah? Okay.
There's one more question a little while back.
Sorry, go on, second.
Someone had a question? There was one more question on the chat. Dave was asking of business examples of attractors.
Well, there are three types of attractors. I mean, there's more, but there's three main ones: single point, dual point, and strange. So single point, the metaphor is normally a basin. You know, so you throw a bunch of marbles or ball bearings into a basin, they'll all settle in the middle. That's a single point attractor. A dual point attractor is oscillation between two stable states. The normal illustration is predator-prey. So if predators go up, prey goes down, that means there isn't enough to predate. So predators go down, so prey goes up. So you get this oscillation. Yeah. The more interesting one in human systems are called strange attractors, which is one of the best known, it's the best name for non-marine science because they're bloody strange. Look at the Lorentz butterfly, right? So basically, no agent follows the same pathway, but the pathways all form a pattern. Now, the work we've done on this links assemblage theory from Deleuze with strange attractors with tropes. So if you look at Trump, and for 4 years of my life, I had to read Trump's tweets every morning. I'm still suffering withdrawal symptoms for a project I'm doing. What Trump is brilliant at doing is there is an established narrative trope or strange attractor. And what happens, and this is Deleuze, all right, with assemblages, people fall into these things. There's a pattern of interaction around story. And you only hear stories which reinforce what you believe. So that's all you see, and you can't escape the trope. Yeah, we don't talk about memes. That's a completely wrong metaphor. Yeah, there isn't a single story trying to replicate itself. What you've got is a mass pattern of multiple narratives and multiple encounters, and that's called a trope. Yeah, and what Trump is brilliant at is he uses key phrases to give energy to the trope, so people can't escape it. All right. Now you see the same thing in organizational culture, right? So if you actually, and this is what we actually do when we map culture in an organization, if you've got those really tight contour lines, you've got a cultural thing which is not going to get disturbed. Right? It's going to be very difficult to disturb it. Yeah, and there are patterns around that. I mean, one of the reasons I focus so much on informal network creation, this is a concept called entangled trios, which you can find on the website, which we're trying in Florida, is if you build a dense informal network, the formal system has less work to do. Because actually you get multiple micro attractors forming in the informal network, and the informal network can solve problems that the formal system can't do because it detects them earlier. Now, if anybody's interested, we're about to launch a major initiative on that on mental health, because the mental health issue is going to be bigger than the COVID issue this year. Yeah. And what we're looking to do is to build multiple entangled support narrative-based networks between people and roles so that the system can detect failure earlier and make micro connections, and fewer things will come into the formal system for resolution. So that's kind of like a nano or a micro attractor approach to change, for example. And just for all of you working in the field, the EU Field Guide is really important. It's the European Commission endorsing a complexity-based approach to crisis and complexity management. And if you just cut off the assess stage, it's actually a manual for strategy, because strategy is managing complexity. Yeah? And that is actually the thing we've all been waiting for. It's that catalyst which creates respectability. Because you don't have to say, I'm using this obscure theory. You can say, look, it says in the European Union Field Guide, I should do this. And that removes the risk. It's like nobody got fired for IBM by an IBM, and nobody gets fired for implementing the McKinsey's report. Yeah, executives will only do something novel if the risk is removed from it. So the handbook actually helps do that. And we're about to, next Monday, we'll launch a whole series of assessment centers, yeah, for the handbook. And we're looking to train independent consultants to run that.
Okay, I covered all the questions on the chat, Dave. Is there any material that you incomplete that you would like to continue again on?
I can talk a bit about entangled trios because I think that makes the point. And I say the trials are going on in Florida at the moment. And to me, this kind of illustrates what complexity is about. This is managing the ecosystem, yeah, rather than trying to work out what you want. This is the creating the capability for the unexpected, yeah? Which, by the way, goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle basically said you can't work out ethics in advance. You have to train people to be virtuous. Yeah, so if people are trained to be virtuous from a young age, you know in general they'll make the right decisions. It's that sort of same sort of principle. Yeah. So the way entangled trios works is you define a series of roles. So when we first did this up in Scotland, roles were things like parent, teacher, pupil. This is during lockdown. Or social worker, nurse, community police officer. I mean, that's one of the ones in Florida. So you define the roles. These are part of the formal system. You then actually identify which pairs will see value in working together. So, for example, local police officers can see value in working with teachers, so they'll be happy to form pairs like that. And then each pair gets a right to form a trio with any other role. And that actually what they choose is then quite interesting. 3 people is a critical dynamic here, by the way. And give an illustration, if you ever go out for dinner with a stranger, all the stress is on you. If you go out with 2 strangers, it's actually easier to handle. Yeah, there's sort of 3, and there's a whole body of stuff on this. If you look at Valdez Krebs' work on network theory, is closing the triad is a key principle of network principles. So we're drawing on that. So basically what we do is we say you form a pair, you then form a trio. We give people an app-based software in which they're doing lessons learned around COVID. We're probably going to release that as a free individual tool next week, provided you share and share alike. So they actually use that tool, and then they can look at more stories like mine. And we're finding that's what people want. It's I'll tell a story, I want to find other stories like mine, yet across that network. And that creates a dense learning environment. Yeah, we found things like kids of health workers. The health workers want to tell the kids stories when they come back. So this gives them a mechanism. It's like a cathartic detuning process. Yeah? So this is messy, and all good complexity work is messy. We call it messy coherence, yeah, which is one of my favorite phrases. Right? Now, the whole point about that entanglement, and that is a deliberate phrase, is that actually you've entangled parts of the formal system with the informal networking. So that means weak signals will be picked up fast, and micro interventions can be done by the roles. So if the community police officer picks up something, they can do something small to make a difference without it becoming a major issue. Right? And so we're running that out extensively in Florida at the moment. We're about to run it out in the NHS in England. Because if we can increase network density, we can radically reduce pressure on the system, because we're increasing peer-to-peer interactions. And you see what we're doing here is we're changing interactions. We're not trying to change people. And it was actually quite interesting. I blogged on this because the same time as the EU handbook came out, one of those big project management associations published the results of 3 years consensus-based agreement on what qualities a leader should have in a time of crisis. Yeah. Now, I've seen thousands of these over the years. Yeah, I mean, I worked with Jack Welch, I worked with Lou Gerst, and I worked with Steve Jobs, right? And I can't believe that anybody could say they had anything in common, which they didn't, apart from all being arrogant bloody bastards, all right? Which is not something you train people to be, right? The reality is they all, in the right context, did the right thing, and with the benefit of hindsight, we recognize it. And one of the key principles of complexity is hindsight shouldn't lead to foresight. Yeah, all of these things are retrospective. So they got all of these, and you look at this, it's a wonderful list, all right? And I quite agree. All of those things would be highly desirable, but nothing's happening. We published the field guide. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with leadership qualities. It says do these 5 things. Right? Now, that's actually quite an important principle. And one of the things we say, and I have a fundamental opposition to the use of Freudian-based approaches in organizational change. I mean, for a start, Freud is like really bad science. I mean, it was cute in the 19th century, guys, but we know a lot more now. Can't please move on, all right? You know, we know about extended consciousness. We know there's no such thing as a subconscious. That's kind of like an artificial dualism and so on. Now, there's nothing wrong with coaching and training leaders and helping leaders get through stuff. I see the market for that. But you can't take a therapeutic approach and apply it to an organization, yeah, on practical and ethical grounds. Because if you take a therapeutic approach, it assumes that the organization needs therapy and it privileges the therapist. And that's dubious. Secondly, I don't think it's ethical for you to say our people should be like this. That's their own bloody affair. It's perfectly legitimate to change the way they interact, but it's not legitimate to tell them that they should have a certain mindset, which, by the way, is one of those other overhauling phrases people use. Yeah? And again, that's this issue about change interactions, see what works. If it works better, do more of it. If it works less well, do less of it. Constantly parallel safe to fail probes, not experiments, because the probes change the space. And as I say, we all know how to do this because it's how we manage families and it's how we manage our lives. So, and open to more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one more from Donald Officer. And Donald asks, how do you apply complexity strategies to the growing global problem of media literacy?
Okay, now that's actually a big thing we're working on at the moment. All right. 6 years ago, we've done this project. And what we do is we get 16-year-old kids in schools working through the teachers, because all schools have a need to teach civics and do statistical analysis and stuff like that. And we also discovered that kids love to get certificates and things which improve their CV. So what we did in South Wales and what we did in Malmo and elsewhere is we created packs for schools by which the school children became ethnographers to their own community. And we normally start that with, did this initially the first time in Pakistan, pulled in 50,000 micro-narratives in a week. By launching a schools program in which school children found the person in their grandparents and their parents' generation they most respected and asked them what story of that person's life the adult thought the child should remember. These are actually called sacred stories, and they're really important to capture. So if you ask me, for example, I'd tell you the story of my grandmother. So round about the turn of the last century, the English decided the Welsh should be educated, which is quite nice of them and really generous. Yeah, but it had to be in English. So if my grandmother was caught speaking Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck called the Welsh knot. She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she handed over the knot, and whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. And there's an English song, Taffy was a Welshman, Taffy was a cheat, which comes exactly from that practice, which makes us even more angry. Everybody in Wales knows that story, nobody in England does. Yeah, and if you do a lot of the work like we do, you find those are defining stories which actually are not understood on either part of the fence. So exposing those is quite useful. So we do that, then maybe next month they go out and do another story. Now what we're doing there, and this is 101 complexity theory, is we're introducing human agency into a network. The problem with the internet at the moment is it's an unbuffered feedback loop. And unbuffered feedback loops always tend to perversion. And the other thing is anything explicit will be gained. Right? I said in Washington 20 years ago, you know, anything an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm can create. Right? So you can't trust that material. On the other hand, if every school in every country in the world is gathering stories every day into an open access database, then when you get a major plague, and I remember writing this 6 years ago, we've got a human sensor network ready to respond. Right? And actually that can handle the media issues. That's a complete turnabout. So currently that's what we're probably going to be doing in the US. If that works over the next 5 months, that will go nationwide. And we're already doing this in Scandinavia. So that sort of stuff is starting to build at the moment, right? And again, what we're trying to do, it links in with a key thing here. If you don't know it, in Wales, we're the first nation in the world to pass legislation. It's called the Future Generations Act. No legislation can be passed by the Welsh Parliament unless it specifically takes account of the needs of the next generation. And we actually have a commission to enforce that. Yeah, it actually stopped a motorway being built because it failed to meet that criteria. Yeah, this is an ecosystems approach as well. So we're the first nation to do that. But what we want to do is to build a system in which you see the present and future through the eyes of the future. And that becomes a sensor network, which is from which you're gathering data, because it's a human buffered network, not an algorithmically buffered network. And it can handle pictures and voice as well as text. And part of the problem I've got is text. What we can write down is about 10% of what we know. Yeah, the impoverishment which comes from text-based communication is really scary. And just to get you really worried, if anybody doesn't know about epigenetics, we now know the mechanism by which culture inherits. All right, and it happens within 2 generations. So if you don't have the right sort of stimulus, then things happen in your RNA which you pass on to your children. Yeah, think about the implications for that. If you're in a family which has had no income and no education for 2 generations, you've got a biological problem, not a sociological problem. We can see that in obesity statistics. Yeah? So that's what we're trying to do for that.
Thank you, Dave. There's another question on metrics from Badra, asking about not to be hung on KPIs, but do we have to develop some metrics in order to decide whether safe-to-fail experiments are moving the system in the good direction?
Yeah, and that's what I call that as a vector measure.
Yes.
So that's one of the things we do. You map the landscape, and then you map how you want the landscape to change, and then you set that as a target. Now, the great thing about that is nobody can manipulate it, because your data is coming from mass self-interpreted narratives. So an executive can see the narratives, which means they can know what to do, but they can't manipulate the target. Whereas actually, it's very easy to manipulate KPIs. If you haven't learned how to do it, you haven't learned how to survive in a large corporate. Yeah. I mean, the key thing is you mustn't be able to trace input to output in any measurement system. And that's what, yeah, if you can't trace input to output, you've got a non-gameable system. And therefore, people have to change their behavior. The problem we got, and this is a problem which came from systems dynamics and cybernetics, is the engineering metaphor which underpins those approaches really scary, because engineers think they can plan everything. Yeah, they want specific targets, they want specific goals. And I understand that, it's a valuable discipline, but it doesn't work in a biological system. And we're trying desperately to move people from an engineering metaphor to an ecological metaphor.
Okay, that's what I have in the chat. Any final questions? We have another 10 minutes with Dave, so before we wrap up.
Okay, if anybody's interested in the EU Field Guide rollout, Monday, the stuff, well, there's already stuff on the website, but the Cynefin Centre website, which is our not-for-profit arm, which does this stuff, that will have all the material.
I know that you have a launch presentation on March 2nd.
I'm doing presentations every hour at the moment on it. We're doing all the preliminary presentations at the moment. So it was quite a relief not to have to present the field guide, yeah, in this one.
I will send out the links post this call for people who want to attend. There's also the Cognitive Edge Haunt, which is a membership-based community of practice. So one could join, and then there is access to premium seminars that happen quite often, and access to Dave in those seminars as well. Joanne, the Cynefin School, what does it do or what does it offer?
We don't have a Cynefin School, we have a Cynefin Centre. So the Cynefin Centre works with government, not-for-profit and academics. Next Monday, if anybody's interested, we're actually going to offer 6 months free membership for the centre, provided you pay for training. Right, just to make it easy for adoption. And the way the Cynefin Centre works on membership is you get fair use, limited use of the software and access to the community for membership. So we work on a membership basis. And we're self-funding, we're not grant-based funding. Because that gives us more freedom. Yeah. And we also have a series of programs. So for example, we have the Citizen Engagement Program. That's also, we've been working with Extinction Rebellion on that and others. That's actually about to launch stuff around citizen juries and citizen assemblies based on complexity theory. Project on coercive control and abuse, which we've been looking at on 3 continents because that's a significant issue, right? We got a project on numinous, which is looking at the role of spirituality in the future of society. That's been run with the American Lutherans and others. So if you look on the website, you'll see a whole body of programs that we run. So you can join the centre as a centre member if you're not for profit, government or academic. Yeah, that's a membership fee. And then you can use the software, and well, the methods are open source anyway, right? A program. So there are program memberships if there's a specific program you're interested in. Oh, good. Thank you, Paul. I couldn't remember it offhand. Anything else from anybody? Oh, by the way, we're currently, what we did 2 weeks ago is we put all of our methods into an open source wiki. Right, now that's quite deliberate because we've been waiting for the EU field guide. That's a catalyst trigger. If you want to expand something very quickly, you put it into open source, you don't put it behind firewalls. Yeah, so you know we will make what money we need to survive off training and support materials. Yeah, but what I was really pleased about is when we announced it, 175 people volunteered to work on the wiki to get it populated, so all the methods in the handbook were fully complete, and all of them are working on average on 3. So we've actually got 450 effective people working on that, and that's actually, from my point of view, that was a big feedback from the network that they saw the value on this. So if anybody wants to be part of that, just let us know and we're expanding that. Okay.
Okay, so I think we are running out of questions and energy as well. So thank you so much, Dave, for being here today.
Pleasure.
And we will post the recording of this event and all the links that Dave was talking about to the articles, as well as the Cynefin book, which is out there, which is more of a practitioner's book. There are questions on Dave's other book he's been
By the way, there are only 30 signed copies of that left. So if you want one of those, I'm giving up after the next 30. Because I keep having to go to the bloody post office with the things. So if you want one of the signed ones, you need to go onto the website and do it now.
I already bought 2 of your book, Dave. I didn't know you were giving away signed copies, so probably I will jump in and buy one.
Cognitive Edge website is somewhere where you can do that, and then I get it and I have to sign the bloody things and put them in cardboard packs and take them to the Avery post office, which loves me because they're making a huge amount of money sending things to multiple overseas destinations at the moment.
And
okay.
I will definitely send out all the links that Dave is talking about, so you can look at the options of the various communities that are going on. And one other big source would be the blogs that he writes. I heavily recommend it, though I struggle to keep up with it. By the time I manage to read one blog article, by cross-referencing all that he has written in the past, there are already a few more to catch up on. So it's a struggle keeping up. So thanks again, Dave, for being here. And we will bring you back again in due time to extend this conversation with the community. We love to have you here anytime.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Bye then.
Thank you.
Thank you.